Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'm very happy to be here to address this symposium, although I am a bit embarrassed to come after that because there is no way that I will even attempt to reproduce what I just saw 5 minutes ago. I'm very happy to be here to talk about a subject that is very close to my heart, both as a scholar of comparative religion and as a human rights activist. And I think it's highly appropriate to talk about political religion and political Islam in the context of the discussion on control as we're having here. So allow me to get straight to the point, but allow me to begin with a few anecdotes and examples. I come from Malaysia and I work in South and Southeast Asia, and I'm someone who has been studying the phenomenon of political religion in South and Southeast Asia for the past 10 years. And I come from a particular part of the world, which I'm not entirely certain how many of you are familiar with. But despite the hype and the tourist ads that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with regards to Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia is, I think, an interesting region at the moment simply because it's going through social transformation that is unprecedented. I come from a country that has, or up till recently, could boast of having the tallest twin towers in the world, and the tallest flagpole in the world, and the longest bridge in the world. And if we could make microchips, we'd probably make the biggest microchip in the world as well. But we also happen to be a country where, at present, a young woman by the name of Kartika Sari Devi is about to be whipped for drinking a glass of beer. I come from a part of the world where earlier this year the Malaysian Islamic Party called for the Muslim feminist organization Sisters in Islam to be banned and its members, including myself, mind you, to be investigated for preaching erroneous or confusing ideas about Islam. Next door in Aceh, Sumatra, Indonesia, the Sharia courts have recently decreed that the punishment of stoning to death will be introduced for adulterers. This is a phenomenon that I've seen over the past 10 years while studying political religion all across South and Southeast Asia. And I've seen similar developments, similar phenomenon among other religious communities in other parts of Asia as well. The rise of right-wing Hindu communitarians in India has also led to the same expressions of religious politics. The call for moral policing, the banning of books, the persecution of intellectuals. For me, there is something interesting about all these developments, be they in the Muslim community or the Hindu community or the Buddhist community across Asia, and that is, despite the moral vocabulary that is used to justify these new laws and enactments and punishments, this entire discourse is couched in terms of a politics of care and concern. In many ways, it echoes the logic of Foucault, a regime of punishment and care of the self. In other words, we whip you for your own good. We imprison you for your own good. We ban books to protect you because we care about you. And this, for me, is an interesting contradiction. It is a contradiction that could only arise at this particular point in the 21st century, where we have a combination of two very interesting elements. On the one hand, religion that in a way has evolved to the point where it has become dogma and ideology, and then the gift of modernity, otherwise known as the modern state. And the modern state, with all its attendant powers, its capacity for legitimate state violence. It's a curious encounter between Hobbes and the mullahs. And somehow this marriage of convenience has created something which I think is historically unprecedented in both South and Southeast Asia. For the first time ever, the modern religious state. The point that I really want to raise here, and I raise this point both primarily as a human rights activist, but also as someone who studies the phenomenon of religion and religious politics. The points I want to raise are two. Firstly, I think we need to somehow understand how and why, for individuals such as myself, this marriage is a marriage that should be annulled. This marriage between the modern state and religious dogma, religious ideology. I want to lead you to my conclusion, which is that somehow the combination of religion and politics is an extremely dangerous one, but I need to explain why it's dangerous, not only for the state, but primarily for religion. So let me try to somehow sketch out what I mean by religion, and to explain why I think the politicization of religion is a dangerous thing. It's odd that we're having discussion here in a church. And it's interesting, as someone who studies religious art and religious architecture, I find commonalities in religious architecture worldwide. We are standing in the middle of a rather impressive edifice, with all the certainty that religion, we hope, would provide. The concrete certainty, empirical proof. But religious architecture has one thing in common worldwide. It is, in a sense, a sort of concrete manifestation of a yearning to know. I've visited churches all across Asia, I've visited temples all across Asia, and I've visited mosques all over Asia. The minarets of mosques reach upwards. Steeples of churches reach upwards. The Buddhist stupas reach upwards. The temples, Hindu temples of India, reach upwards. As if in all these religious traditions there is a common yearning to render in concrete this attempt to touch the heavens, to communicate, to literally touch God. But touching God is not a very easy thing to do, and the reason why I really object to religious ideologues today who speak about God with such a glibness, with such a casual refrain, as if God was one of their friends on Facebook. And I find that actually very, very alarming, to know God in such an intimate, friendly way. I'm also struck, as someone who teaches comparative religion, on how, in the genesis of religions, that certainty is not there. So let me just relate one anecdote to you, which I think is often forgotten. And the anecdote actually has to do with the very foundational moment of Islam itself. Now, the history books and the narrative accounts tell us of how the revelation came to Muhammad. And I find this episode very interesting, because for me it encapsulates what religion, with a capital R, religion per se, means and signifies. In the course of his meditations, Muhammad meets the angel who is the emissary of God. And the angel says unto Muhammad, recite. Muhammad responds with a question, recite what? What do you wish me to recite? The angel replies, recite. Again the question is asked, recite what? What do you wish me to recite? And finally the revelation comes. Recite in the name of God that created humankind from a clot of blood. I find this episode interesting for the simple reason that it demonstrates that at the very genesis of Islam, at the moment of revelation, there is already contingency and uncertainty. This is not the year zero of Islam, this is the second zero of Islam. At the moment of revelation, there is uncertainty. You do not know what God wants. And you cannot understand, you cannot have the foreknowledge of the radically other. It is interesting that at this precise moment there is anxiety. And from this anxiety arises ethics. Hence the question, recite what? Why? Why is the question asked? In order to know, in order not to misrepresent the intention of the other. And in this moment of Genesis, all the ambiguities of faith are there. And for me, this demonstrates faith in its rawest form. Faith, to believe in that which you do not know, is an enterprise that is laden with risk, with chance, with contingency, with accidents. There is no certainty. To communicate with God is to communicate with the radical other, that which is radically outside the economy of the same, the familiar, the human. It is talking to the alien, and you don't know how to talk to an alien at the first instance. This contingency is central to faith. The uncertainty which differentiates faith from cognition. I know I have two hands because they are right in front of me, but I cannot claim to know God. You can only believe. And belief is always a risk-laden, contingent enterprise. And yet, fast forward to the present and look at the state of normative religious praxis all over the world today. And this is where my anxiety, my present anxiety, stems from. My anxiety today stems from the fact that the anxiety of that foundational moment is not there anymore and has been replaced instead by certainty. Absolute, blinding, loyal certainty, which I believe is unwarranted and dangerous. It is that same certainty which compels people to control, to dominate in the name of God, justice, morality, ethics. But go back to the initial foundational moment itself and look at the primacy that ethics plays in that initial moment of contact, that first contact. Religion, for me, epitomizes that. If religion is to mean anything, it has to mean the need to be ethical in the relationship with the other, be it the radical other, God, or with other human beings. That ethics has to inform your religious praxis. But looking at the state of religious politics in Asia today, I do not see ethics, but only politics. Religious communitarians, religious conservatives are the first not to dialogue, not to attempt to understand, not to be ethically responsible to the other, but the first to judge the other. The first to pronounce judgment over those who are different. And this is true of all the religious communities in South and Southeast Asia at the moment, and particularly true in the case of the rise of political Islam in Southeast Asia. Religious conservatives are the first to denounce and judge those who belong to gendered minorities, those who belong to other faith communities. Somehow that contingency that was so crucial in the foundational moment of religion is no longer there when religion is turned into political praxis. So what I witness in Southeast Asia and South Asia today is, as I've said earlier, this rather unhappy marriage of a modern technocratic mindset that has wedded itself to a modern state apparatus. And oddly enough, contrary to the opinions of those who criticize political religion as something as primordial or essentialist or backward, all I see is modernity at work. But modernity in one aspect. The same modernity that led us to concentration camps, the same modernity that led us to ethnic, racial, gender segregation, the same modernity that led to the creation of the plural colonial economies, that led to racialized capitalism, at work in the context of modern religious states in South and Southeast Asia, particularly in places like Malaysia, where I come from. And this places people like me in an awkward position. On the one hand, being firm believers in the value of human reason, of human rational agency, but on the other hand, having to watch this evolution, this recent evolution of a new form of religio-political sensibility, which on the one hand combines all the intellectual tools of modernity, the technocrats' propensity to plan, control, map out society, with a sort of return to a very dogmatic form of self-righteous dialectical religious politics. How then do we even begin to understand what is happening today? And if there is to be a critique against what is happening in a country like Malaysia, where should the critique come from? Is it a critique of modernity? Because if we were to look at the most negative expressions of this newfound religious politics in a modern state like Malaysia, it would come in the form of the modern institutions that we see in Malaysia today. The Sharia court that judged the woman for drinking beer is a modern construct. It is a court with functionaries that are professional individuals hired on a contractual basis. Laws are not arbitrary but codified, and codified in the form of modern laws. If we were to look at the faith rehabilitation centers that have been set up in Malaysia, where people are re-indoctrinated to accept the correct form of Islam, this is modern pedagogy at work. Behind barbed wires, of course, but nonetheless, modern pedagogy at work. Textbooks are used. Modern modes of instruction, social engineering, are in practice. So oddly enough, I find myself in an awkward position of being a secular social democrat trying to re-inject religion in the essential sense that I mentioned earlier back into this equation. I find myself now in a very peculiar position of trying to remind religious ideologues of the essential meaning of religion itself. I have to remind Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians in South and Southeast Asia of the arbitrary, contingent nature of religious revelation, something which they, as religious ideologues, have forgotten. And I think this forgetting of the very contingent, accidental nature of revelation is something crucial for the modern religio-political project to be launched. In a way, you have to forget the dock for the ship to be launched. And I think this systematic, deliberate forgetting of the murky, grey moment of Genesis is precisely the thing that has allowed political religion to get off and be launched in the context of South and Southeast Asia today. It puts me, I think, in a very difficult position to also explain the phenomenon of what we are seeing in the world. But in all fairness, in all honesty, I can only conclude from what I see in South and Southeast Asia, and in particular in Malaysia today, that what we are witnessing at the moment is the phenomenon of political religion, and in particular politics, once again on the march, rather than religion per se. I see no Islam in any of this, by the way. Nor do I see Hinduism in the right-wing communitarian politics of the Hindutva movement in India. Nor do I find Buddhism in the religio-politics of Thailand and Sri Lanka. But I find a lot of politics there at work. And I think it is this uneasy combination of the two, this ease with which faith has been superseded by politics, where dialogue has been superseded by dialectics, that should, I believe, serve as a cause for alarm for all of us today. What we are witnessing, contrary to what many of the religiophobes of today have been preaching for a long time, is not so much the revenge of God, but perhaps in a sense the forgetting of God itself, or rather the forgetting of the impossibility of contact with God. The thing that I find redeeming in that episode that I related to you at the beginning is that it actually contains a number of themes that exist parallel and simultaneously. On the one hand, it reminds you of the proximity of the radical other to the self. It reminds you of the proximity of God to man, or God to human beings. But at the same time, it reminds you of the impossibility of contact, the difficulty of contact with this which is so close to you. Perhaps in the end, God should not be that close to us. Perhaps in the end, it is actually good to maintain some distance, some ambiguity to God, and perhaps not to talk about God on a first name basis. I suppose in the end, the only way we can rescue faith, ironically, in the context of Southeast Asia and in countries like Malaysia today is not so much to utter God's name in vain, but perhaps to be slightly more respectful of the name of God and to maintain this difference to God as the unknown. God is as alien to us as an alien from outer space. And I believe that this distance is actually precisely the thing that needs to be maintained today, rather than to have God inform you when policies, particularly policies of social governance and social control, are being legislated by governments in countries like mine. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, wonderful.